So I just want to welcome everyone to our Ancestral Healing online call. And this is, I think, the fourth one of these that we've done so far. And it's a lovely opportunity to be kind of just an informal community setting and to engage in conversation about what does it mean to be in relationship with ancestors, and what does it mean to bring healing to the ancestors, and why does it matter? Like, what is all that about? And in the modern world where we're living in the technology age, how do these kind of old sounding ways of being integrate and relate with our lives today? And so I'm really excited to see where our conversation will go. It's always a surprise, and I'm always so touched by the sharing that everyone brings to the experience. And so I figured we would just start off today with a prayer so that we really call ourselves into this space and clear any of the heaviness we may be carrying in from all the things of life, so that we're just a little bit more clear. So if you would, just let yourself get comfortable in your space. And if you feel comfortable closing your eyes, I invite you to do so. And just really let yourself come present into your own body and into the space where you are right now. And if your feet happen to be touching the floor, bring your attention there for a moment, acknowledging your connection to the earth. And feel your body sitting in your seat. And really taking in the support that's there, allowing you to be comfortable and relaxed. And bringing your awareness to your breath. Noticing if your breath is moving in the belly, or in the chest, or somewhere else. And allowing the breath to deepen a bit. And I'll start us with a prayer. So much gratitude for this opportunity to be together tonight in this community space, and to spend this time diving just a little bit into this conversation and this work of connecting with the ancestors and exploring what healing is needed at this time. I call the elders, the masters, the teachers, the wise ones, the guides, the guardians, and our radiant, well grandmothers and grandfathers, our ancestors. Please join us in this space. Help us to navigate this conversation with grace and understanding, and help us to see the next steps forward for our own paths, coming deeper into alignment with the truth of who we are. And for all of this, we thank you. And when you feel ready, go ahead and bring yourself back, opening your eyes. And I just want to again welcome you to this conversation. Um, so I thought I would begin just by sharing a tiny little bit about my own journey here, so that you know a bit about where I'm coming from and why I'm having this conversation in the first place. My name is Angela Blueskies, and my background is in music. I spent a lot of years as a classical musician, and for the last decade, I've been working as a sound healer and sacred musician in the context of shamanic work, and also in an expansion of what I have come to understand as the yoga of sound and silence and meditation. And so through many, many years of exploring sound and energy, I came to really deepen my understanding of the practice of shamanic journeying. And so for the last 15 years, I've traveled to Peru many times to work with teachers there and to explore a lot of things that fall under this umbrella term shamanism, but which I probably would put more appropriately under a term animism. And we'll talk more about animism in a little bit because it's a really important piece of ancestral healing work, I believe. So in 2016, my father died, and I found myself really, really called by my own ancestors to dive into this work. And I'd already been doing ancestral work in conjunction with my shamanic practice for a number of years, but something bigger was calling to me. And so I began to explore it, and I began to work with other teachers and people exploring ancestral work in the context of the contemporary Western world based in technology and mind. Because I was able to see the divide between like the traditional cultures that I had engaged with in Peru and our modern culture, where we've lost touch with things like being in relationship with the ancestors and what does it mean to be in a relationship with the land and nature and really ourselves in a deeper way. And so through the months and now years of navigating the loss of my father, it became really clear that I was called to bring this work of ancestral healing in a new way. And so I've trained in this work, and I've worked with some really amazing teachers, including Malidoma Somé, who is originally from West Africa, who now lives and teaches in the US. And I've also worked with other wonderful teachers who bring in ancestral calling, like Joanna Macy, and also I've trained with Daniel Four. So I appreciate that we can sit here in our homes with our technology in this modern dystopian world and come back to the depth of what it means to connect with who we are through our roots. And so we've had a number of calls that have gone in a number of different directions. And as I really contemplated this week, what do I feel like is the next step in this conversation? And I really felt like tonight would be a really good time to explore the ancestors and our connection with nature, and how the work of ancestral healing can actually help to heal the separation that modern humans feel from the natural world, and the cultural movements that have led to that being the case. And so before we go any further, I just wanted to share a little quote from a book that I've been enjoying. I usually like to bring some kind of book into this so that you can explore further if you like. So the book that I've been reading recently is If Women Rose Rooted by Sharon Blackie. And if you've never heard of this book, it's something truly treasure. It's a treasure. I love it. It particularly looks at feminism and story and mythology and ancestors and culture and the land in a very deep way. And so I wanted to just share with you something that I was reading in here the other day. The stories we tell about the creation of the earth and the origins of humankind show us how our culture views the world, our place in it, and our relationships with the other living things which inhabit it. And when I read that, it lit up every single strong feeling within me. Like, this is the sickness of our culture. And I'm really blessed to live in a rural place on top of a mountain. My partner and I chose that on purpose purpose so that we could live connected to the land every single day. But I know that we're really lucky, and that so many people long for that connection and don't get to have it in their lives all the time. And so I'm hoping that this conversation tonight can open in a direction that inspires some work in that for each of you. So before we go any further, I just want to open space for any questions or sharing that seems good for this time. So if you wish to share, just unmute yourself and jump on in. All right, maybe we should continue. So I don't know how you spent your day today, but I woke up this morning, and after the first 15 minutes of getting ready, I jumped in my car. I drove to town. I had an appointment. I drove to the grocery store. I bought some food. I came home, and as soon as I got home, I sat down in front of my computer, and I worked for the rest of the day in front of my desk. And I think that that's probably a pretty normal way of spending the day. Anybody else's day look something like that? Connected inside. and and yet I hear, like right now, I hear the cicadas singing outside, the song of the late summer nights. Uh, and there's something strong within me that calls me to go and be with all of that. And yet these movements in our culture are so strong that tell us to do the things that are really important, right? Do the things that make money, do the things that keep you comfortable in your home and in your family and in your environment. And there's not always a lot of space to contemplate those deeper things. And yet, doing the work of relating with the ancestors, even approaching it in this way of being on the computer and being together in all these different places, it's interesting, and it's kind of almost amusing that this is so far from the way that our ancestors lived, especially if we consider like how far back we can connect with the ancestors. We can connect hundreds and thousands of years at times when our ancestors were living in relationship with the land because they depended on it for their sustenance. So I'm curious to have each of you share with me if you have some sense of where your people are from in the world. That could literally be what state in the United States or what other country. Anything that you know about your people and how they might have lived a long time ago, however you define a long time ago. So when you're ready to share, just unmute yourself and jump on in.
Hello, it's Nicole. Can you guys hear me okay?
Uh-huh.
Okay. So I actually don't have a lot of information. I have some good information about my mother's side of the family, being that, you know, we're mostly Irish and also Native. I don't really have any information on my father's side of the family. So one of the things that interested me so much about this is the idea that I have ancestors that I know nothing about. I know that they were Irish. I'm, you know, assuming that they were generally farming, hunting, you know, as far back as I can imagine. But there's really, I mean, I'm just basing that on kind of common sense. I don't really know for sure, you know, where everybody came from. I know that on my mother's side, the Native side, the tribe that my ancestors are from is no longer in existence. And that was something else that kind of drew me, was because I kind of wanted to honor them in their struggle and their journey, and be able to express gratitude to them, even in a way when the name of their tribe is hardly ever spoken anymore. So that's all.
Thank you.
Hi, Tel.
Hi, Elle.
It's so weird doing this on a phone. Um, so my family, obviously, there's significant heritage from Africa, but both of my grandparents were biracial. So one was German and of African descent, not knowing where in Africa that side was from. And then on my grandmother's side, she was Filipino and of African descent. Um, and just it's weird to me because I have information about my heritage but not necessarily an understanding of what that means. Because I think just the current experience is dominated by the African heritage. And then also I was adopted. So I do know my biological and my adoptive side and the heritage on both sides, but I think sometimes that makes me even more curious about my ancestry because I'm all of those things through blood and then through love and influence.
Thank
So
you,
that's what I
Elle.
mean.
So your biological parents are part German and then part Filipino and then
Yeah,
from Africa.
yes.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing.
Hi, it's Charles.
Hi, Charles.
And I grew up with my grandparents because my mother and father divorced before I was 1 year old. And I've never met my father. I've had some conversations with him on email, and I know he was accomplished in radio and television. He had his own talk show on a DC TV station in the 60s, and he's very conservative. So I don't think we would necessarily get along. So I know very little about, or next to nothing about that side of the family. I know he was a star scholar athlete and probably has had a very good, accomplished life, family. And um, my grandparents came from West Virginia, and my mother and stepfather did extensive genealogy. And I know that it's Irish and Scottish, and I come from Clan Cunningham. I know that there were, and then they were in the Appalachians of West Virginia, I think central West Virginia. And I know there were farmers and doctors and store owners, among other pursuits. And so I think I have, I think I've gotten a creative gene probably from my birth father's side. I don't know if my mother's side had any creative artistic people. But I have a feeling that since my grandfather was a doctor and his ancestors were doctors, that I have some of that in my makeup. And so I'm glad to be on the path of shamanic healing practices. They've helped me immensely, and I've been able to help people a few times with that. And I'd like to pursue that further, of course. But when I was growing up, my grandparents had very little, I never met anyone past my great grandparents. Being from West Virginia, I do know from my uncle that a lot of them were very fundamentalist Bible type people, and maybe even from snake handling type practices, and witnessing. What's your testimony? What's your witness? Type of fundamentalist Christians.
You know what's interesting to me is I also grew up in a place where those traditions were around. I think mostly Pentecostal, and to me, that's shamanic Christianity. I think most of them probably wouldn't agree with that, but that's kind of, I don't know, that's kind of how I've seen it as I've studied that path. I'm curious about your grandparents. Are you speaking, these are your mother's parents?
Yeah.
Okay.
And my stepfather's parents, his father was an eye, ear, nose, and throat physician when that was a specialty, EENT. And now they go more into individual specialties in the medical profession. But yeah, on my grandfather's and my grandmother's side, and there's a few soldiers in the Civil War. There were a couple of soldiers documented. Um,
So it sounds like your ancestors have been on this land in this country for a long time. Then, at least on your mother's side.
right? Yeah, and even probably as far back as the American Revolution, because
Mm-hmm.
my grandmother tried, and she didn't really was not successful in tracking down whether she had any uh, soldiers in the Revolutionary War, but she wanted to be in the Daughters of American Revolution.
Beautiful. Thank you
But
for
I know
sharing,
nothing.
Charles.
So I feel a little bit disconnected also, and sometimes I have a lack of interest, and sometimes I have more of an interest in the genealogy because I don't have much interest in my stepfather's side, and I didn't know or didn't grow up knowing anything about my mother's side, but I just feel like there's some fascinating stories and people in there.
That's been true for me as I've done genealogical research alongside ancestral healing work. So, and some lineages just, they drop after a couple of generations. You can't find anything else. I think this is more true for lineages that are female, like grandmother lineages, because unfortunately for most of our recorded history, women were property. And as their names changed, it wasn't always recorded very well. So I found that to be true for more than one lineage that I've researched. And I think that's also true for people who have ancestry that is not purely of European origin. I've had a number of clients that have African ancestry or Asian ancestry, including my spouse is half Filipino. And those things are sometimes hard to track in records because different cultures track information differently and they have different priorities. And so many of the original cultures in the world were oral cultures. They didn't have so much in the way of written records like what we have now with like everything on Google for as far into the future as we can imagine is probably pretty foreign to most of our ancestors. Anyway, Charles, thank you for sharing so much beautiful information.
Thank you.
Angela?
Amy, or is that Elle?
Oh, yes. I just was going to add quickly, if it's okay.
Please.
I forgot to mention, I actually grew up in the Midwest. So I come from Middle America by way of the South. And then my family's actually, the maiden lineage is through the Ritchie side, which is actually significantly Irish. And a lot of the folks on my biological side, many of them passed. So that kind of adds to my interest in our ancestry as well, because many of them were living successfully as something other than what they were for many generations.
Can you say more about what you mean by that?
So a lot of them were of African descent, but were so fair because of the mixed heritage. They were living as white for many generations. So like people within the African American community would know, but people in the larger community didn't. And there's a lot of energy about that in the modern current family. So I didn't mean to exclude Amy. I'm sorry.
Elle, I appreciate you adding that additional bit of nuance because these are cultural threads that are so alive right now in coming to see the bigger picture of who we are individually and as a culture. And so much of the time in spiritual work, there's just this big movement to love and light and everything is beautiful. But I think that skips over the really important work of coming to see all of the pieces of who we are as the living face of all of our ancestral lineages existing in this world at this time. And those are really important pieces of your history and your culture that you've been handed and that you're carrying, whether you choose it or not.
Right.
And in the work of ancestral healing, that's so important. Like, to me, ancestral healing can't be divided from cultural healing, because all of the things that have ever happened in history have influenced the people who birthed us.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate you bringing that in. Thank you for jumping back.
Thanks. Sorry, Amy.
No worries, no worries. Thanks for sharing. I, in my ancestral line, I know more about my mother's side, more in a more personal way than I do about my father's side. So my mother's side, they are primarily Scottish and came over. We haven't been here really that long. And I've actually gone to Scotland and visited kind of some of the areas and some of the clan castles and stuff like that. So that's been really cool. My grandfather was really big on genealogy, not just of his own family, but of his wife's family and going on back as well. And let's see here, there have been quite a few on my mother's side. There have been quite a few doctors, both male and female, which was pretty unusual for that time period. Let's see here. I think his great aunt, I think it was like the first woman doctor in Germany. What else? Let's see here. My mom was born in my grandfather's hospital in Philly. And let's see here. Yeah, going back. Yeah, my grandfather would always make sure to tell stories about we would always hear, every summer we'd go to visit, we would hear stories about either our great-grandfather, mostly about them, because they were like the first people to come and came over, nothing, dirt poor. I think one of my favorite stories was he said the two brothers had one pair of pants between them for a while when they were working on the railroad. They used to traded the pant off to see who could go to work that day. So, else? And then on my father's side, his cousin did a lot of genealogy work on his father's family, and going back, I think they made it back to like the 14th century. So that was quite surprising. And then at one point she gave him, I guess it's the family Bible, and it has a listing of everything in a big breakdown. And it was just kind of a benefit because they came over, they settled, and they stayed just in one place. And that was the case for both sides. So.
Thank you, Amy. So almost all of the lineages that I've researched have been on this land for at least 300 years. There are some lineages that dropped off very quickly. My father's mother was Cherokee, and there's no record of her name. There's no record of anyone before her. So it's hard to find that information. But of the lineages that I've been able to research, like the ones that are native, obviously were on this land for the long haul. And then the ones that were European came from France and Scotland and England, way back at the beginning of people doing that migration. And, I think it's interesting what you brought up here. I think it was you, Amy, that brought up how the people in your family came with nothing. And I think especially as I've researched my own lineages back to the very beginning, like my father's lineage, when that ancestor left France, he was basically run out because he was like high up in the French Protestant church. He was a leader in the community, and I think I found all of these books that were referring to him by name, and he like was involved with working for the king, and then he had to go because Protestantism wasn't allowed anymore. It was outlawed. And it was interesting for me to take that information and then go into ancestral healing work and understand a lineage that was like kind of nobility and upper crust and well-educated and well-respected, that then had to flee and then came to this new land where there was no infrastructure and no anything. And being a high up like noble within a church environment is like irrelevant, because you got to eat and you got to stay protected from the elements. And so it's really interesting to look at those cultural movements, and they're so diverse for each of us. But I think that's one way that doing genealogical research can really come together with the work of ancestral healing. And so we've been talking about ancestors and place and our people's lives, but we haven't even really defined ancestral healing. And so I don't want to spend too long on that. I just would like to name a little bit of what that means to me for the purposes of this call. So when someone dies and they're not in this world anymore, in an animist framework, that spirit goes on in some way. And of course, every culture has a particular belief system around that. And there's so many animist cultures, there's no way to really quantify it in a more specific way. But animism says that everything is alive and that everything is in relationship with everything else. And so in order to engage with ancestral healing work, that's pretty much the only premise you need to be able to buy into. There's not a particular religious system or spiritual belief system that is behind this beyond that. And so if everything is alive, not just people and animals, but like trees and rocks and the soil and the stars, if all of it's alive and we have the ability to be in relationship with all of it, all of a sudden the family gets a lot bigger. And so ancestral healing, in the way that I practice it, seeks to bring us into relationship with our specific blood lineages, our mothers, and all the grandmothers before them in that lineage, or our mothers, fathers, the grandfathers. Like, it's possible that we may have some ancestors that we're already in relationship with. Like maybe someone in your family died and they come to you in dreams, or you feel their presence with you, and it's supportive and beneficial and loving and really life affirming. And that's awesome. That is most likely a really good, well ancestor. But unfortunately, in most of the Western cultures, we've lost our ability to connect with the kind of practices and traditions that help us to be in good relationship with the whole lineage or ancestors. And so if we were to go back far enough, in almost any animist culture, there are people in a community that were responsible for helping the dead at the time of death to make sure they fully left this world and got to the other one, wherever that is, and that whatever pain or suffering or conflicts or mess they may have died with internally, emotionally, mentally, energetically, that would be cleared as much as possible so that they didn't keep feeding it back into the family. But as the major monotheistic religions came into play, a lot of these traditions were outlawed and they were considered devil worshipping, or, I mean, fill in the blank. There's so many different judgments on traditional spirituality and traditional cultures in these ways. And colonialism tried to slash and burn most of them in all around the world. And so the kind of practices that kept people in relationship with ancestors and kept people practicing those kind of rituals around the time of a person's death, those haven't been widely practiced in a really long time. And so when someone dies, we have funerals and we have prayers, and maybe that person's really lucky. A whole lot of people engage with that process of grief and love. But it's possible that a lot of the people who die, like the things that need to be cleared in order for them to fully leave this world and to be well and to leave wellness behind, like those processes don't always happen now. And so if we look around our world, even if we just look in any one direction, there's so much sickness. Like we have children at the southern border in prisons being abused in horrible ways. And we have refugees in parts of the world that are fleeing for their lives, and money is ruling the world, and capitalism is the fundamental way of everything. And so our ancestors aren't always made well at the time of death, and our ancestral lineages haven't always been kept in rich contact. So The work that I am engaged with, and that I'm hoping that this conversation will continue to be centered around, is not only making sure that some ancestors are well, but to try to make sure that all the ancestors, all the way back to where the wellness ends, become well again. And it's beautiful to know that this work doesn't depend on space and time like we do. It's totally possible to engage with the original wellness of the lineage and to clear all of the heavy crap that's been passed down from generation to generation. Because even if someone were to say what I'm saying right now is just woo-woo nonsense, okay, that's fine. But the reality of epigenetics, for example, is discovering that the conditions that affected one generation can be passed down several more generations, almost like an evolutionary change or like a DNA pattern imprint. And so those are the very things that are living in us now, the things that happened to our great-grandparents and their great-grandparents. We just keep passing it on down through the ways that we relate with each other, throughout the ways that we relate with the world around us and the environment. And so those things are in us whether we choose to look at them and believe them or not. And what I appreciate about ancestral healing is that it gives us the opportunity to look at all of that in one big soup, to look at the problems that we may be having in our own lives that seem bigger than us, and in our families and our relationships, whatever conflicts or discords or wounding that there may be there, probably is happening on a spectrum that's bigger than the people, like standing right there. And it's possible to look even further back to find the roots of that. And so ancestral healing that I practice is anchored in lineage more than individual ancestors. But when a lineage is clear and all of that stuff has been looked at and understood, the stories that need to be heard have been heard, the stories that don't serve anymore have been dropped, and the wellness of the lineage is moved forward so that we can embody it. Wow, what a different world is possible. And so I think that, for me, what I'm looking at so much right now is like our connection in our modern culture to capitalism, and how much of our lives is determined by like what we're supposed to have and what we need in order to survive and who we're supposed to be in order to be successful and okay. And those aren't things that are often like determined from inside of ourselves. Those are things that are kind of imprinted by our culture. You're supposed to have a good job, and you're supposed to have so much money and a house and a family and a car and whatever other things. And you're supposed to look this way, and you're supposed to be this thin. You're supposed to be this beautiful. You're supposed to be this strong and this successful. And you're supposed to be able to do all the things at the same time. And I don't know anybody that can really carry it well. And yet so much of the time we're not exposed to something else. We're not exposed to questions that ask us early enough in our lives, like, who are you? Like, why are you here? What is the magic that you carry into this world that is yours and that now belongs to you as the face of your ancestral lineage? And also, what is the pain that you're carrying that is not yours, that you've been handed, that you could let go of? And I guess as I continue to like spend time contemplating, our modern capitalist patriarchal culture, like I really see how these systems have been put in place to divorce us from the questions that we can find inside of ourselves. And like, who am I? What is my beauty? What is my power to affect change in this world? And who am I as a leader? Who am I as like a compassionate, loving being? You can't sell that stuff. You can't market it. No, you can try, but it doesn't work so well. And instead of seeing the world as a commodity that we are here to take advantage of, to do with whatever we want, in an animist framework, like, well, so we're in relationship with our ancestors. That's how we come to know who we are. And we're in relationship with the world, with all the other beings and nature and the trees and the forest, the ocean, the desert, whatever kind of place we find ourselves in relationship. Who are we then? And if we're in relationship with all of these other things, all of these other beings, is it possible to see them as resources for our taking, or are they our brothers and sisters and companions on this path? So I guess to me, at the point where I am on my ancestral healing journey, I found more than ever my ancestors have pushed me to slow down and not just look at the healing that I need inside of myself from my life, because I'm seeing these things that are challenges, and the healing in my family unit that I'm seeing that are challenges. But who am I in relationship to the land where I live? Like, how am I a steward of that? How am I in respect with that? Like, do I do my best not to run into that spider web because that spider has as much right to be here as I do? These are things that my ancestors have pushed me to look at, because if I'm going to respect myself and I'm going to respect the world around me, everything changes. So I'm going to pause there and open space for any sharing or any questions that have come up in this conversation.
In my kitchen, I have a bunch of spices in a spice cabinet, and in front of that, I have a bunch of spice jars. But after I was gone at the Naturist Festival and came back, there's a spider web all over the spice jars, and there's a little hidey hole, and there's a spider living down in there. And I don't necessarily want my spice jars covered with this web, and I don't want to disturb the spider, but I got to figure out how to get the web off of there and relocate the little critter or something.
I love it. Thank you, Charles.
Hi, I was really struck by what you were talking about with the epigenetics. I think you finally kind of helped me have the word for this really strange phenomenon that I'd been experiencing. So I've been into plant medicine and things like that for as far back as I can remember. But my adoptive family is not into any of that. So they were often like, where does she get this from? Like, how does this beam down upon her? Because it's just nowhere in the realm. It wasn't in my community, my culture, nothing. And then I find out that my biological great-grandmother, who passed on the day I was born, but 1 year prior, and predicted my birth before my mother could have conceived me, was in fact what they called a white witch. And plant medicine was her whole thing. And many people sense, within my birth family, people talk about the many aspects of her that I embody. And this is somebody I've never met, I know nothing about, but I also have intuitively had a sense that she was kind of covering over me throughout this whole process. And I feel like maybe that's the epigenetics, or it's something that just came to me outside of this whole nurture thing. So I was like, thank you for that word. I'm going to be Googling that a lot. I was like, I've never had a word for the phenomenon.
I love it. Epigenetics is a science that is still, I believe, kind of in its early stages. But there are definitely studies that I've read with single-celled organisms, that what you do to the first generation lasts for, I can't remember if it was 7 or 10 generations, or maybe even longer than that. And there have been other studies that look at, for example, children of people who grew up in the Great Depression, like their grandchildren or great-grandchildren, are struggling with things like obesity, not because of their lifestyle choices, but because of the biological changes that happened from extreme scarcity. And that's not mental. That's not a choice. That's something that's happening. That's got its own deeper flow. And I love that there are these studies that are now starting to recognize these things. But in terms of spirit work and ancestral connection, you said it was your grandmother that was the white witch?
Yes. It was on my birth side. It was my great-grandmother.
Great-grandmother.
She passed before I was even born. And then it was even more interesting because there had been significant health issues. And I really started digging into our lineage to find out that every generation of women on my birth side had the same health challenges. But the reason why my outcome seems to be different than everyone else's is I returned to plant medicine instead of Western medicine.
Yeah.
So I think my great grandmother was already on to something, and then it got lost, and then somehow they give a kid away and she gets some kind of spirit memory. I don't know. It's really weird.
And, you know, like we do think it's weird in our culture, but I bet if you were to go back like 5 generations, people would say, or maybe, I mean, depending on the specific lineage or culture, but people might say, of course, like, yeah, and
Right.
that's
Right.
normal. Like, why are you even pointing that out? We expect that.
Right.
And so I have this whole background as a musician, and I started working as a sound healer about 10 years ago after exploring shamanism for about 5 years. Like, it became really clear that my path was to fuse music and shamanism. And so I, you know, like most of us Western people who are raised in a culture of deep independence and individualism, and we believe that we are unique flowers in the world that are created out of our own ideas and work and whatever. Those are things that contribute, of course. But I began the work of ancestral healing, and I had these 3 grandmother guides that appeared for a particular lineage. And they were going to be the ones that helped me to heal the line, and I'm still in relationship with them now. And as they started to bring that lineage into a healing containment space, one of them leaned down and started to sing. And she did this with her hand, and I could see the energy of the song moving through the line. And I was stunned. This is a guide I'd been working with for years. And I didn't realize that that guide was an ancestor, and that guide is also like, I do that. Like, that's the part of the work that I do. And here I thought, oh, I'm a sound healer. What a strange thing to be doing in the 21st century contemporary American world. Not really so weird when it's in my lineage, like from what, 2,000 or 3,000 years ago or more, who even knows? So those things are accessible. And through this work, we make connection with guides, and we form relationships with guides that are just as palpable and real and deep as the kind of relationships we're having right now in this conversation. And the guides can help us to see, oh, this is your thing. Like, oh, what should you be doing in your life? Well, look, you're already doing what you should be doing in your life. This is a gift of this lineage. And so the work can not only help us to heal things that we are longing to heal, it can help us to really discover who we are as individuals, and our power, and in our gifts that are our birthright. But through doing that can really help us to know who our people have been for a really long time, and what is the energy of that lineage, and how can that be brought through the most fully today in order to help bring healing to this world. And as I've done ancestral work and connecting with guides, almost every single one has some kind of really strong connection with some element of nature in some way. I have one guide that is like thunderstorms and earthquakes and hurricanes, and she is a force to be reckoned with, and she will clear any shit that's got to go really fast. And of course, the energy of that lineage is strong, fierce women with gifts, women who don't want to hear any crap, women who are just really empowered. And so how wonderful to be able to connect with that essence of lightning and storms and earth energy, like the earthquakes, and to be able to embody that in myself. That's not exactly a quality that modern Western culture encourages women to embody. Like, that's a heathen kind of thing. And so we're undoing the stories that our culture has told us for how long, you know? All right, well, a woman is supposed to be like this, or a man is supposed to be like this. It's the same thing. We all have the stories, the scripts that we're handed that we're supposed to fit into. And through doing the ancestor work, it's possible to unweave those stories and come to the truth of who we really are, and what we want to be in relationship, and how we want to live in this beautiful world that is our home. And so I'm loving this conversation, and I don't want us to run out of time before we have the opportunity to do a little meditation together. So I want to invite you to let yourself get comfortable again, and let your eyes close. And again, connecting with the breath. And letting your body relax. And let your attention go back to the ancestral information that you connected with earlier in your sharing here. The places your people are from, the ways of life that they knew. And I just want to invite you to check in to see if there's any particular landscape or element of nature or just any other kind of life form or place that comes to mind in connection with a particular lineage. And really let your attention settle on just one. And if you're a person that enjoys visualization, see how vivid an image you can paint in your own mind of this place or of this particular being. If you're not a visual person, just see how you can evoke it in your senses. And as you sit with this connection, explore how it makes you feel to be in the presence of this. And allow your imagination to wander a bit and imagine how your ancestors may have connected with this place or this energy or this being. What kind of relationship would that have been like for them? What are the gifts that you feel that this connection brings to you as you sit with it? And just opening yourself to receive blessings. Amplifying them as much as you can possibly receive. So I just want to close our meditation with a poem by Linda Hogan. And the Russian women in blue towns are speaking. The flower-dressed women of India, women in orange tents, dark women of the Americas who sit beside fires, have studied the palms of their hands and walk toward one another. It's time to bless this ground. Their hair is on fire from the sun, and they walk narrow roads toward one another. Their pulses beat against the neck's thin skin. They grow closer. Daughters, the women are speaking. They arrive over the wise distances on perfect feet. Daughters, I love you. As we prepare to close our meditation, just inviting the blessings of this connection with whatever part of the world that has come to bless you tonight. Asking that these blessings stay with you in the coming days, continue to help you to understand a little bit deeper your connection to your people and the places that they called home and held sacred. And when you feel ready, you can go ahead and open your eyes.